The nurses called her the ghost. Not to her face. Never to her face. But when Sarah Chen moved through the fluorescent corridors of Oak Creek Memorial's night shift in San Diego, that's what they whispered, something ethereal, something that didn't quite belong to the visible world. Dr. Hargrove, the ER director with his Italian leather shoes and his network of hospital board connections, had overheard the nickname twice and filed it away like evidence. A ghost! A woman who appeared at traumas and disappeared after, whose hands moved with a precision that made residents look careless, whose presence somehow made him feel less essential. He didn't like that feeling. He didn't like her. The night shift started at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday in November, and Sarah arrived 30 minutes early the way she always did. She moved through the ER in her faded scrubs, the fabric worn soft from 1,000 washings, her badge clipped to a lanyard that had seen better years. Her name was embroidered below the photo in letters so small most people never bothered reading it. She touched the inside of her jacket lining before stepping into the trauma bay, a ritual that took 3 seconds, a fingertip against something thin and fabric thin, something that felt like remembering. The faded unit patch was still there, stitched carefully into the seam where no one could see it. Dark Horse. The emblem of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, the unit her late husband had commanded before his last deployment. Before the Navy SEALs of SEAL Team 3 had brought him home in a flag-draped case. She pressed her palm flat against it and breathed in through her nose. Then she turned and walked into the controlled chaos of a Tuesday night ER. The waiting room held the usual inventory of human damage, a construction worker with a crushed hand wrapped in a bloody towel, a teenager with a twisted ankle that he kept insisting wasn't that bad, an elderly woman clutching her chest and denying everything, an agitated man in a tank top who smelled like methamphetamine and poor decisions. Sarah noted each one without looking directly, the way a military operator scans a room without stopping on targets. Threat assessment. Resource allocation. Priority triage. The muscle memory didn't shut off just because she wore scrubs now instead of combat gear. 12 years of that kind of thinking didn't evaporate because she'd signed a piece of paper and promised to disappear into civilian life. Dr. Hargrove was already at the physician station, his tailored coat draped over a stool, his sleeves rolled up to exactly the elbow in a way that suggested calculation. He was reviewing lab work for a patient in room 4, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his expression locked in the particular kind of concentration that was really just performance. He looked up when Sarah approached with the admission clipboard for a multi-vehicle collision that had just come through EMS. 3 patients. 2 ambulances. 1 trauma level 2 and 2 trauma level 1s. Bad night getting worse. We'll need all 3 bays prepped, Sarah said, her voice flat and procedural. The first one's a dashboard chest, possible tension pneumothorax. Hargrove took the clipboard without looking at her. That would be the surgeon's concern. You prep the rooms and get out of the way. She didn't respond. Just turned and moved toward Trauma Bay 1, where the first patient was already being transferred onto the gurney with the kind of controlled urgency that meant serious injury. The patient was a man in his 50s, his breathing labored, his skin the color of wet newspaper. One of the paramedics was bagging him, squeezing oxygen into lungs that the chest trauma had made unreliable. Sarah moved without hesitation, her hands already reaching for the equipment she'd need, the 14-gauge angiocath needle, the flutter valve, the antiseptic swabs. Her fingers bore old scars, rope burn that had healed into white lines across her palms and forearms. Rope burn from repelling operations in Helmand Province. From 6 years of extraction work that the military would officially deny she'd ever done. 2 residents came in, the paramedic said, handing off the paperwork. One's checking on the other patients. One's coming straight here. Sarah nodded, her focus already on the patient's chest. She could hear the wheezing, the high-pitched whistle that meant trapped air, that meant a pneumothorax that was getting worse with every breath. She placed her hands on his ribs, feeling the position of the second intercostal space with the same tactile certainty that a musician feels for the strings of an instrument. The ultrasound machine was already warming up. Someone had remembered. She grabbed the wand and ran it across his chest in the fast protocol, focused assessment with sonography for trauma, and there it was. The collapsed lung. the free air pressing everything to the side like a car jacked up on concrete blocks. One of the residents rushed in, a young man named Chen, maybe 28, still in his first year of his EM rotation. He was moving fast, but he was moving scared. Sarah could see it in the way his eyes tracked without landing, the way his hands hadn't found their purpose yet. Tension pneumothorax, Sarah said quietly. Second intercostal, midclavicular line. Should I get Dr. Hargrove? The resident asked. She was already opening the angiocath, already feeling the skin for the exact anatomical landmark, already beginning the needle decompression. The patient's breathing had started a shallow, desperate pattern. No time for hierarchy. No time for chain of command. Just a person whose lungs were being crushed by their own body's betrayal, and a set of hands that knew exactly how to fix it. The needle went in. Just the first catheter, thin as a straw. It was a temporary measure, a bridge to the chest tube they'd place next. But that first thrust, the immediate hiss of air escaping, the pressure equalizing, that was everything. The patient's oxygen saturation, which had been falling, stopped its death spiral. Began to climb. 40 seconds. That was how long it took Sarah to identify the problem, access the site, and decompress the tension that had been collapsing his lung. 40 seconds while the resident watched and learned and didn't get in the way. 40 seconds while somewhere in the hospital, decisions were being made by people with titles that mattered more than competence. Chest tube setup, she said. And get me a thoracotomy tray. We need to be ready if this was a penetrating injury. The resident moved toward the supplies, but he hesitated. Should I? Just get it. We don't have time for permission. She didn't look at him while she said it. Her eyes were on the monitor, on the patient's vital signs, on the color of his skin that was beginning to pink up again as his oxygen saturation climbed toward 80, toward 90, toward something that meant he might actually survive the next few hours. Her hands were moving on their own now, muscle memory taking over. Palpating for the fourth intercostal space. Prepping the skin with antiseptic that smelled like medicine and industrial cleaning products mixed together. The scent brought back nothing. She'd trained herself not to let scents carry memory, but her body knew exactly what came next. The chest tube was placed in 90 seconds. The breath sounds returned bilateral, equal, clear. The patient's blood pressure, which had been dropping into the unforgivable range, stabilized at something that kept him in the living world. By the time Dr. Hargrove arrived in the trauma bay, 3 minutes after the first alert, the crisis was managed. The patient was breathing. The monitor showed a rhythm that meant survival was possible. Hargrove took in the scene with the quick scan of a man assessing blame. The patient, stabilized. The equipment, deployed correctly. Sarah, standing back from the gurney now, her hands already reaching for the sanitizer that hung from the wall. She was erasing herself, the way she'd learned to do. Making space for the official story. Good work, team, Hargrove said, which meant he was already constructing a version of events where his arrival was the crucial moment. I'll take him from here. Resident, stay with me. We're going to need an OR stat. Sarah finished with the sanitizer and turned toward the door. The second patient from the collision had arrived 3 minutes ago, already in Trauma Bay 2 with a lower leg amputation and active bleeding. The third was in Trauma Bay 3, alert but complaining of severe abdominal pain. There was no time to stand and receive gratitude she would never get. As she passed through the threshold, she caught her reflection in the glass partition separating the trauma bay from the hallway. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, she saw herself the way the hospital saw her. A middle-aged Asian woman in scrubs. Quiet. Competent. Forgettable. The kind of nurse that hospitals needed and then forgot to compensate. The kind of person who made other people look better just by doing the work that no one else wanted to do. She pushed the image away and kept moving. Break room was empty at 11:15. Sarah opened her locker, third one from the left, combination 19-4-7, the date her son had graduated from the Naval Academy, and there was the photo. A man in navy dress whites, his uniform pressed sharp enough to draw blood, his face holding the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. James Chen. Lieutenant. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Her husband. 12 years ago now, which felt impossible and inevitable at the same time. She pressed her forehead against his photo, just for a moment, and when footsteps approached, loud, rushed, the gait of someone who owned the spaces they moved through, she closed the locker quickly and turned toward the sink. The smell of hospital antiseptic filled her sinuses. In the mirror above the counter, she could see Dr. Hargrove entering without knocking, moving toward the coffee machine like it owed him something. "The Ghost," he said, not looking at her. "Interesting nickname. Some of the nurses were discussing you in the hallway." Sarah was washing her hands with the precision of a surgical scrub, 15 seconds minimum between the fingers, under the nails, up to the elbows. "Just a nurse," she said quietly. "Just a nurse who's very interested in procedures. That chest tube. I assume you know the technique." She turned off the water, and the silence that followed was the kind that carries weight. 12 years of trauma rotations, she said, which was not quite the truth but was also not quite a lie. "You see certain patterns repeat." Hargrove smiled then, and it was the smile of a man who'd just decided something. "Well, we'll see how well those 12 years hold up under actual scrutiny." He left before she could respond, carrying his coffee back out into the night shift. Sarah stood at the sink for 3 more seconds, her hands dripping, her reflection fragmented in the wetness. The other residents would be talking about the trauma case. About how the decompression was executed. About whether the ghost had overstepped. And Hargrove had just marked her? The next hours moved in their usual rhythm, traumas and lacerations, chest pain that was anxiety and chest pain that was real, 3 overdoses and a woman in early labor who'd come in thinking it was just gas. Sarah moved through each situation the way she'd learned to move through the world, present but invisible. She saw things before they became critical. She anticipated needs. She made decisions that kept people alive, and then she stepped back before anyone could thank her or question her or notice the authority that lived in her competent hands. What she didn't know was that Dr. Hargrove had started making calls. That somewhere in the morning, background checks would be running. That her carefully constructed cover, the 12 years of civilian nursing, the references that didn't quite exist but also weren't quite fake, the civilian life that was really just a long deployment, was about to begin developing cracks. But that wasn't tonight. Tonight was just the long fluorescent hum of the ER, the beeping of monitors, the work that kept people alive. And a doctor in an Italian leather shoes who'd just decided that the ghost was going to have to disappear for real. The medication room at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like antiseptic and organized chaos, plastic drawers labeled with drug names, the soft click of the refrigerator where temperature-sensitive vials lived in climate-controlled darkness. Sarah Chen stood at the counter, her hands moving with the precise efficiency of someone who'd mixed field medications under mortar fire. A 12-year-old in room 8 needed pain management before the orthopedic reduction. The chart said 20 milligrams. Her eyes caught the weight documented in the nursing notes. 43 pounds. The dosage was wrong. Dr. Hargrove stood at the computer station outside the room, Italian leather shoes catching the fluorescent light like a statement about who belonged in this hospital and who served him. He'd written the order with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to watch a child seize from an overdose. Sarah pulled the correct dose, 12 milligrams, into the syringe and walked toward the examination room. The surgical resident, Dr. Patel, was positioning the ultrasound probe across the child's fractured femur. 12 milligrams, not 20, Sarah said quietly. Her voice carried no accusation, just correction, the way you might tell someone their shoelace was untied. Dr. Patel's eyes flicked up. Then down to the chart. Then back to the dosage Sarah held. The pause lasted maybe 3 seconds. In that pause, hierarchy cracked like ice under spring thaw. Dr. Hargrove materialized in the doorway. His jaw tightened. He didn't say anything then, just watched as Sarah administered the correct dose, as the child's frightened mother relaxed slightly, as the room continued functioning with clinical precision. But something shifted in his posture. His shoulders squared. His breathing changed. When he turned away, his hands were fists. 2 days later, he struck. The patient was an elderly man, a femur fracture that needed reduction before surgery could proceed. His wife sat in a chair beside the gurney, worry carved into every line of her face. Sarah had set up the sterile field, instruments arranged in perfect order. The reduction would take 20 minutes. Her hands were gloved. Her technique was flawless. This was work she'd done in field hospitals where improvisation meant the difference between walking and amputation. Dr. Hargrove entered with the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned. Halfway through the reduction, he stopped mid-movement. "Nurse Chen." His voice was loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Explain to everyone here why you contaminated this sterile field." Sarah's hands froze. Not from shock. From the recognition of what he was doing and the tactical assessment of how to respond. Did they teach basic protocol wherever you got your nursing degree? He dragged the last 2 words across the air like an insult. His smile was a knife edge. The wife's face filled with alarm. The resident stepped back. The room seemed to hold its breath, fluorescent lights humming their electric song, the monitor beeping its steady rhythm, a world waiting for someone to break. Sarah met his eyes. She took one measured breath. When she spoke, her voice dropped into a register that hadn't emerged in 3 years, low, calm, absolute. "I've held together men with worse injuries than this using field dressings and prayer. Your doubt doesn't shake me." Each syllable cut. Not loud. Precise. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of and choosing not to use it. She returned to the reduction without waiting for his response, her hand steady as surgical lasers, every movement economical and lethal in its competence. Hargrove's face reddened. His mouth opened. Nothing emerged. He left the room, and the reduction proceeded in absolute silence except for the soft click of instruments and the steady beep of monitors. When she finished, the wife whispered, "Thank you." Sarah nodded once and left without reply. The next shift, she discovered her performance review posted on the unit bulletin board, visible to every staff member who passed it. Red pen marks slashed across the page. Deficiencies in team communication. Inability to accept supervisory guidance. Questioned physician judgment in clinical settings. The comments were surgical strikes, each one positioned to destroy credibility without crossing into actionable territory. She stared at it for exactly 5 seconds. Her jaw clenched once. Then one tear escaped down her left cheek, not from sadness, but from the fury of knowing what was happening and understanding the futility of stopping it. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with the page, then turned and returned to her rounds. The hallway stretched ahead of her, fluorescent and endless. In the break room, the pattern accelerated. Sarah sat down to eat during a rare 15-minute break. Within 30 seconds, the room cleared. A resident remembered an urgent consult. A charge nurse suddenly needed to check the supply closet. A student nurse grabbed her coffee cup mid-pour and left, the liquid sloshing onto the table. She ate alone, methodical bites, her eyes on her phone screen though she wasn't reading anything. Just existing without being present. The technique was old: establish a hostile environment, social isolation, make someone feel like contagion. She'd seen it used on forward bases. Hadn't expected to see it in San Diego. But that wasn't the worst part. During her 3rd shift that week, she was sent to check on a patient in room 12. Army Ranger named Captain Chen, evacuated from Helmand Province after an IED blast caught him during a convoy ambush. The chart documented combat injuries, but his status was stable, sedation before tomorrow's surgery. She pulled up his vitals and stopped. Captain Captain Chen. Not just any ranger. The man who'd taken command of her son's platoon. The man who'd held his hand during a satellite call home and promised, "Your mother will see you again. I give you my word as an officer." She checked his chart. Verified the sedation was holding. Confirmed his airway was patent and his oxygen saturation was solid. Then she touched his hand once, just her gloved palm against his forearm, and left without a word. The sound of her rubber-soled shoes on tile was the only thing she left behind. A resident whispered in the medication room later that night. Sarah heard it while counting controlled substances. Hargrove's calling her the phantom nurse. Says she thinks she's invisible. The laugh that followed was small and cruel and utterly convinced. At 2:08 a.m., the automatic doors exploded inward like a concussion. The figure that stumbled through was 6'4", maybe 240 pounds, Army Ranger combat fatigue shredded across the chest where something hot had torn through muscle and fabric. A sucking chest wound, audible even from the triage station, that wet whistling sound that meant air was pouring into the pleural space with every breath. Blood saturated his uniform. His eyes were wide, pupils blown like saucers, scanning the ER for threats that didn't exist anymore, only in his nervous system, only in the firefight still playing behind his eyes. His hand moved toward his belt in a gesture pure muscle memory, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Contact left, he roared, his voice like thunder in a confined space. Security guard Martinez dove for his radio and backed toward the desk. The triage nurses didn't even finish their conversations, they just scrambled behind the partition. Registration staff dropped below their counters like the ER had become a war zone instead of a hospital. The fluorescent lights buzzed their indifferent song, completely unconcerned with chaos. Dr. Hargrove appeared from the physician's lounge, took one look at the bleeding Ranger with wild eyes, and retreated back through the door he'd come from. His Italian leather shoes didn't make a sound on the tile as he left. The Ranger stumbled. Caught himself on a wheelchair. Blood continued spreading across his chest, not trickling, spreading like ink in water. Sarah Chen stepped out from the supply corridor. 30 feet between them. She didn't run. She didn't freeze. She walked toward him with the deliberate pace of someone approaching a wounded animal, not a threat, just steady and present. Her hands came up, visible at shoulder height, palms open. No gloves, no weapon, no uniform insignia, just a woman in scrubs moving toward danger while everyone else moved away. When she spoke, her voice dropped into a register no one at Oak Creek Memorial had ever heard from her. Low. Calm. Absolute command. Ranger, eyes on me. Threat is down. You're stateside. Stand down. The man's head swiveled toward her. His pupils tracked. The wildness cracked, just slightly, just enough, as confusion cut through the combat haze. Corpsman, he whispered. That's right. I've got you. Let me get you to a gurney. She closed the distance with leverage techniques that shouldn't work but did, a grounding maneuver that used his own disorientation against gravity, positioning him down onto the nearest gurney with movements so practiced they looked effortless. Muscle memory wasn't just his. It was hers too. His breathing was labored. Wet. Each inhalation a struggle because his lungs were drowning in fluid accumulating in the pericardial sac. Cardiac tamponade, Beck's triad incomplete but signature. Distended neck veins. Muffled heart sounds. Blood pressure dropping like a stone. Minutes, not hours. I need a 14-gauge angiocath, Sarah called, her voice cutting through the chaos like steel. Move. A nurse from cardiac appeared with equipment. Sarah's hands were moving before the words registered. The needle went in, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, and the hiss of air escaping filled the room like a gasp of relief. The Ranger's breathing shifted. Eased. His oxygen saturation crawled upward on the monitor. 94, 97. Stable. Dr. Hargrove reappeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with the expression of a man watching his carefully constructed hierarchy shatter like glass. The automatic doors exploded inward at 2:56 a.m. Not open, exploded. A towering figure staggered through like a freight train running on fumes, 6'4" of muscle and blood, army fatigue shredded across the chest, combat boots leaving wet prints on the tile. His eyes were wild. Not angry, the particular kind of wild that comes from watching the world through a haze of shock and adrenaline. Sarah recognized it instantly. Combat shock. The kind that made men dangerous without intention, their nervous system screaming threats that weren't there. Security retreated. Two officers who'd seen active duty themselves took one look at the ranger's size and the haunted focus in his eyes and decided this was above their pay grade. The night shift staff scattered like startled birds, nurses and techs pressing themselves against walls and doorframes, creating space for something their training had taught them to fear but never fully explained. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above the chaos. Sarah walked toward him. Not quickly. Not tentatively. She moved with the unhurried precision of someone walking into a familiar storm, hands visible and open at her sides, shoulders relaxed. Her voice dropped into registers it hadn't used in 3 years, registers that lived beneath her scrubs and her false civilian identity. Low. Command presence without command voice, there was a difference. The ranger's head snapped toward her at the sound, his eyes locking onto hers with the intensity of a laser finding a target. "I need you with me right now," she said. 8 words. Each one placed like a stone in a path. "You're in a hospital. You're safe. Follow me to the stretcher." It wasn't a request. That was the thing, the tone made it impossible to refuse. The ranger had been trained by the same systems, had breathed the same command chain air. His body recognized authority before his conscious mind caught up. He staggered forward, and Sarah positioned herself to catch his weight without making it look like she was catching anything. A 240-pound combat veteran who'd taken impact from something violent enough to shred military-grade fabric. She guided him onto the gurney with movements that looked almost choreographed, though nothing about this was planned. Just muscle memory. Just 18 months of combat triage drills conducted in compounds that shook from indirect fire, where the difference between a clean procedure and disaster was measured in millimeters and seconds. The ranger's breathing was labored, his mouth working around words his lungs couldn't quite deliver. Sarah's fingers found his carotid pulse and everything went silent in her mind, that particular silence that comes from focusing completely. The pulse was thready. Weakening. She tore open his shirt, and the bruising told her everything she needed to know. Mottled discoloration spreading across his chest like watercolor bleeding through wet paper. His jugular veins were distended, swollen like the vasculature of some creature pushed beyond its limits. Her mind ran through the cascade, tamponade. Pericardial fluid compressing his heart. The heart can't fill, can't pump, and every second the pressure builds is a second closer to cardiac arrest. Cardiac tamponade, she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made people move without questioning. "I need a pericardiocentesis kit. Now." A paralyzed nursing assistant just stared, eyes locked on the blood, on the size of the man, on the sheer wrongness of the situation. Sarah didn't repeat herself. She grabbed the crash cart herself, snapped on gloves with a sound like gunshots in the sudden silence, and began prepping the subxiphoid area with skin antiseptic in movements that could have been performed in darkness. Her hands had done this before. Done it when the walls were shaking. Done it when a mortar round had collapsed the eastern corner of the compound and dust hung in the air thick enough to choke on, when she'd held a penlight between her teeth because her hands needed to be free, when the man she was operating on was a young private from Kentucky whose name she never learned because he coded before she got his name. The ranger's eyes found hers and cleared for just a moment, the fog of shock parting like curtains. "Helmand," he breathed. "The compound." "Were you?" His voice faded. His eyes rolled back. No time for answers. No time to process recognition. No time for anything but the procedure. She positioned the needle at exactly the right angle, too shallow and she'd miss the pericardium entirely, too deep and she'd drive the needle straight through the heart muscle and end this man's life with her own hands. The angle was everything. The angle was always everything. She advanced the needle with the steady precision of someone who understood that her hands held more power than any rank or title ever could. The subtle give as the needle pierced the pericardial sac, that small resistance that meant she'd found the right plane. She aspirated, and dark fluid filled the syringe. The ranger gasped like a man breaking the surface after drowning. His chest rose and fell with something that approached normal breathing. The pressure released from his heart like air escaping from a punctured tire, like the world exhaling. Sarah completed the procedure with practice speed, secured the catheter, initiated fluid resuscitation through 2 large bore 4s, called for a CBC and comprehensive metabolic panel, arranged for a stat chest CT. Each action flowed into the next with the seamless quality of something she'd rehearsed 1,000 times. The ER staff slowly emerged from their defensive positions like animals after a thunderstorm, staring at her with an expression somewhere between gratitude and fear. They'd never seen her move like this. They'd never heard her voice carry this kind of absolute certainty. The ranger's hand caught her wrist. His eyes were clearer now, more present. The veil of shock lifting enough to let his conscious mind emerge. He stared at her face with the intensity of someone trying to recognize a ghost made flesh. "Phantom," he whispered. His cracked lips barely moved around the syllables, but the word landed like ordnance. His call sign for her. Not her name. Never her name. The call sign she'd earned in compounds that didn't officially exist, for operations that never happened, for a career she'd been ordered to forget. Before the word had finished echoing, Dr. Hargrove's voice cut across the ER like a scalpel. "Step away from that patient, Nurse Chen. Security, escort her to my office. Now." He was already on his phone, his face flushed with the kind of rage that came from watching his carefully constructed hierarchy crumble like wet chalk. Sarah could hear fragments, practicing beyond scope, emergency board meeting, immediate termination protocols. His network was moving. She could hear it in his voice, the sudden shift from minor irritation to full institutional assault. He'd called administrators. Called hospital lawyers. Called his allies in the medical director's office. 2 security officers approached reluctantly, men she recognized from the night shift, men who understood on some cellular level what she'd just done. They'd seen the ranger's vitals on the monitor. They'd watched his oxygen saturation climb from 68% to 94%, had heard his breathing shift from the rattle of a dying man to something that approached normal. They knew. Sarah removed her gloves, each motion deliberate and final. Gloves came off in layers, right hand over left, then left hand over right, then into the trash without haste. She was already walking toward the administrative wing before they had to touch her, moving between the officers with the casual certainty of someone who'd walked toward far worse things than a termination meeting. The ranger called after her, just her call sign, repeated like a prayer or a promise. She didn't turn back. That was protocol. That was survival. That was the choice she'd made 3 years ago when she hung up her rank and put on scrubs. The ER doors swung shut behind her, sealing away the beeping monitors and the hiss of oxygen. Sealing away the life she'd saved. Sealing away the only world where she'd ever truly belonged. The security office was cold. Steel chairs. Fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects trapped in a fluorescent tube. Sarah sat alone for 43 minutes while Dr. Hargrove's voice carried through the adjacent wall, thin drywall that might as well have been paper. She could hear every word. "I need you to contact these references immediately." His tone was ice. "Yes. All of them. I want her credentialing file pulled by end of business today. Activate the external review committee." A pause. The sound of papers shuffling. "I don't care if they're busy. Tell them I'm calling in favors." Sarah stared at her hands. The same hands that 40 minutes ago had performed a pericardiocentesis in 38 seconds flat. The same hands that had guided a needle through the pericardial sac while a wounded ranger's cardiac output climbed from 55 to 82 milliliters per beat. The same hands that had done this procedure in a collapsing compound in Helmand Province under mortar fire using nothing but a 14-gauge angiocath and prayer. Those hands were shaking now. Not from fear. From rage. From the terrible clarity that came when you realized you'd made a single mistake, not in medicine, not in procedure, but in humanity. She should have let him code. She should have stood back and watched Dr. Hargrove fumble through a blind needle stick while the ranger's heart collapsed. That would have been safe. That would have been invisible. That would have kept her buried. Instead, she'd saved a life. And now the walls were closing in. The door opened. A security supervisor she didn't recognize entered, middle-aged, uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact. He carried a small manila envelope. "Dr. Hargrove has activated immediate administrative suspension pending board review," he said, not meeting her gaze. "Your badge, access card. You're to leave hospital property within 30 minutes. Sarah didn't argue. Didn't protest. Didn't speak. She simply removed her badge lanyard, 3 years of accumulated layers, the hospital ID photo taken during onboarding, the CPR certification dated and expiring, the access fob that had opened the trauma bay doors 10,000 times. She placed it on the metal desk with precise, controlled movements. One sound. That's all it took. The plastic edge hitting stainless steel. Outside, rain hammered the parking lot like mortars on a roof. Sarah drove on autopilot through San Diego's pre-dawn streets, past the darkened shopping centers and closed gas stations, toward Mountain View Cemetery in the hills. The oak tree she parked under was ancient and dripping. Leaves stuck to her windshield like hands trying to hold her in place. The headstone was white marble. Cold. She could feel its temperature through her wet scrubs. Lieutenant James Chen, Navy SEAL, 1978 to 2015. Sarah knelt in the mud. Not gracefully. Her knees went out and she fell forward, hands pressing into the earth, rain soaking through everything, her scrubs, her jacket, the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining. The patch was dark with moisture. She could feel it adhering to her ribs like a second skin. "I stayed hidden like they ordered." Her voice didn't sound like her own. It sounded like the sound of a helicopter rotor slowing down. "I followed every protocol. Kept every secret. 3 years, James. 3 years of being nobody. Invisible. Safe." Rain poured down her face. She couldn't tell if she was crying or if the sky was just destroying her one drop at a time. "That ranger knew me. He said my call sign. Said it like we were back in the compound, like we were still brothers. And I couldn't even acknowledge him. I couldn't even nod. I had to pretend he was just another patient." Her voice cracked. "I failed him. I failed our son's brothers in arms. What was it all for, James? What was any of it for?" She pressed her forehead against the cold stone. The marble was slick with rain. Her shoulders shook, not trembling, not weakness, but the kind of violent shuddering that comes from holding yourself together for so long that the seams finally tear. The faded unit patch inside her jacket was soaked through. She could feel it there, heavy as guilt. Her phone showed 17 missed calls. Numbers she didn't recognize. Hospital extensions. Board office. Legal department. She silenced the phone. Sat with her dead husband while the rain washed away any distinction between tears and storm water. The gravestone didn't offer comfort. But it offered something else, a place where honesty was permitted. Where the pretense ended and only the truth remained. She had walked away from this life to protect it. Had buried Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen in an unmarked grave so that her son could grow up thinking his mother was just a nurse. Just a woman who worked night shifts and came home tired. Her knees were numb. The rain had soaked through to her skin. She finally stood, water running down her neck, and turned back toward the parking lot. The board hearing was convened at 0900 in Oak Creek Memorial's main conference room. Mahogany table. 12 people in business casual. 2 external reviewers that Dr. Hargrove had personally selected weeks ago. She understood that now. He'd been planning this. Building his case. Activating his network like a chess player who'd been thinking 5 moves ahead. Sarah sat alone at the respondent's table in borrowed business clothes, pants that didn't fit right, a blouse borrowed from a nurse who hadn't asked questions. No legal representation. No witness list. No evidence to present. Dr. Hargrove stood. He had slides. "This woman performed procedures that are completely outside the scope of nursing practice," he said, clicking through images of the trauma bay. "An emergency pericardiocentesis is a physician-level intervention. She acted without attending physician authorization. Without even informing me that she was proceeding." He paused for effect. What she did was technically practicing medicine without a license. He clicked to the next slide. Sarah's employment file. "Her credentials don't match her performance. I've had external reviewers examine her file. There are inconsistencies. References that don't correlate with stated employment history. A gap of 7 years between 2008 and 2015 where her background is unclear." He leaned forward. "I move for immediate termination and referral to the California Board of Registered Nursing for licensure review." The board chair, a woman named Donovan, nodded. She was about to call for a vote when the doors opened. A wheelchair rolled in. The Marine orderly pushing it was massive, dress blues pressed sharp enough to cut. In the chair sat a man with a white fur pole attached to his chair, bandages around his chest, eyes that had seen things no human should see. His hand reached forward. "Phantom," he whispered. The room went absolutely silent. Not the quiet of respect. The quiet of a door opening that everyone realized should have stayed locked. From the gallery, a young man stood. Army dress uniform. 23 years old. Her son's jawline. Her late husband's eyes. That senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. The words hung in the air like a detonation. Murmurs erupted around the mahogany table. The external reviewers leaned forward. A cardiac unit nurse, Sarah barely remembered her name, stood with shaking hands and read from a manila folder, Naval Special Warfare Command, Classified Personnel File, 17 Combat Medical Evacuations Under Fire, Helmand Province, 2012 to 2015, Certifications in Underwater Demolition, Tactical Trauma Surgery, Advanced Weapons Systems. Her voice strengthened with each line. The board members began taking notes. The legal counsel whispered to the board chair. The doors at the rear of the room opened again. A man in Navy SEAL dress whites entered. Master Chief Patterson. Beard gray now. Trident gleaming on his chest like a promise kept. Senior Chief Chen holds the Navy Cross for actions in Kandahar Province, he said, his voice carrying the weight of classified operations and names that couldn't be spoken. Extracted 12 wounded Marines under sustained fire. 2 silver stars. 3 bronze stars with Valor. She's trained every combat rescue swimmer corpsman in advanced trauma medicine for the last decade of her military career. He paused. Let it land. Her call sign was Phantom because she got our boys out when extraction was impossible. Dr. Hargrove's face drained to gray. His hand shook. The board chair opened her mouth to speak, but federal badges appeared at the back doors. 2 FBI agents. 1 woman. 1 man. Both moving with the precision of people who'd made arrests before. Dr. Hargrove attempted to delete security footage of last night's life-saving procedure at 03:47 this morning, the lead agent stated. However, Marcus Torres, IT security specialist and former Marine Corps communications chief, preserved every frame and filed a formal report with this office at 0633. She held up a tablet. On the screen, the trauma bay. Sarah's hands. The needle. The hiss of air escaping. The oxygen saturation climbing, 68, 75, 82, 91. Stable. We're also investigating falsified performance documentation and potential defamation in the circulation of unverified credentialing concerns, the agent continued. Mr. Hargrove, you're going to need legal counsel. Sarah stood. Slowly. The entire room was looking at her now. Not at the widow. Not at the night shift nurse. At the rank. At the call sign. At the woman who'd been invisible for 3 years and had just been pulled into the light whether she wanted it or not. Her son stood in the gallery, tears running down his face, finally seeing his mother exactly as she was. The room went dead silent. Captain Marcus Chen was wheeled in on a stretcher, oxygen mask fogging with each breath, bandages wrapped tight around his ribs where the surgical team had saved his life. His hand lifted, trembling, but deliberate, and he reached toward Sarah across the conference table. 3 words escaped his lips like a password to another world. Phantom. That's Phantom. Dr. Hargrove's face changed. Color drained like water from a sink. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Her son stood from the gallery. James Chen Jr., 24 years old, Staff Sergeant, his voice cracked and broken as he said it. That Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. He couldn't stop staring at her. Neither could anyone else. Mom. That's who she is. A nurse from the cardiac care unit, Rebecca Torres, 12 years at Oak Creek Memorial, stepped forward with a classified military file in her hands. Her voice shook as she read. Classified evacuations under fire. 3 missions in Helmand Province. Kandahar, Jalabad, Forward Operating Base Shank. Combat medical interventions under hostile conditions. 18 personnel extracted alive who would not have survived standard protocols. Rebecca looked up. 23 documented lives saved in a single deployment. The federal agents exchanged glances. One of them nodded slightly, clearing someone to speak. A SEAL team leader in dress whites walked to the center of the room. His uniform was crisp as paper, his bearing the kind that made the air pressure change. He carried himself like a man who'd given orders in darkness, who'd seen things most people couldn't imagine. When he spoke, his voice was measured and precise. Bronze Star. He paused. Board members leaned forward. Silver Star. Another pause. Second Silver Star. The room had stopped breathing. And a Navy Cross. Awarded for valor under fire, June 2011, Helmand Province. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen was the commanding officer of a medical response team that held together 17 Marines under enemy fire for 4 hours until extraction was possible. 4 of those men would have bled out without her interventions. He turned directly to Dr. Hargrove. That was before the operation you never heard about. Before the Pentagon ordered her to disappear into civilian life. Before she spent 3 years being called just a nurse by people who had no idea what they were standing next to. Dr. Hargrove pushed his chair back so hard it clattered against the wall. This is irrelevant. She violated scope of practice. She performed procedures outside her credentials. I have documentation. The federal agent held up a hand. You also have deleted security footage. That's a federal offense, Dr. Hargrove. We recovered every frame. The pericardiocentesis. The needle placement. The arterial access. All of it. The agent's voice had the flat tone of someone reading facts into a record. Marcus Torres, your IT director, reported the deletion attempt at 3:27 a.m. yesterday. We have his preserved backup. We have your login accessing the system at 2:19 a.m. We have the deletion command executed at 2:34 a.m. We have the timestamp on your phone showing you called a criminal defense attorney at 2:41 a.m. The hospital's legal counsel, a woman named Diane Prescott who'd been elevated by donors and always favored administration, closed her eyes. She already knew where this was going. You attempted to destroy evidence of a life-saving procedure, the federal agent continued, performed by a decorated Navy officer, in order to protect your professional reputation. That's obstruction of justice. Federal jurisdiction. We're not done yet. Through the conference room windows, Sarah watched the scene unfold like she was observing someone else's catastrophe. Dr. Hargrove was led outside by legal counsel and federal investigators. His hands moved frantically as he spoke, gesturing, pointing, his mouth moving rapidly as if volume could somehow rewrite what everyone already knew. The whole network he'd built was crumbling in real time. Board members he'd called that morning wouldn't meet his eyes. External reviewers he'd brought in were reading her actual military file, their faces pale as they understood what they'd been used for. Within 40 minutes, his hospital credentials were suspended pending investigation. Within 3 days, the full scope emerged. Performance reviews he'd falsified for 3 other nurses who'd challenged him. Medication errors he'd blamed on night shift staff to protect his record. A pattern of retaliation stretching back 5 years, documented in personnel files that suddenly mattered to lawyers. Medical board investigators found irregularities in his own licensing file, a residency evaluation that didn't match the program's records, citations expunged after donor intervention, the kind of institutional whitewashing that only worked until someone finally looked. The San Diego Union-Tribune ran the story on the front page: ER director falsified records, targeted decorated Navy veteran. His wife's family, the hospital donors who'd secured his position in the first place, released a statement distancing themselves with the speed of people abandoning a sinking ship. His medical license entered emergency review status. Professional references stopped returning calls. He was toxic, and every administrator who'd elevated him now scrambled to prove they'd never really supported him at all. 6 weeks after the board hearing, a hospital janitor named David Morales photographed Dr. Hargrove at a strip mall outside Chula Vista, miles from any hospital, sitting alone at a folding table under a sun-faded banner that read "Supplemental Insurance, let me help you save." His tie was crooked. His hair needed cutting. He was explaining deductibles to an elderly grandmother who kept shaking her head, both of them uncomfortable in the heat. The photo circulated among Oak Creek Memorial staff like contraband, like justice distributed in pixels. People looked at it in break rooms and felt something settle in their chests, not joy, not exactly, but the weight of consequence finally arriving. 6 months after that, Sarah Chen stood in the training facility at Camp Pendleton wearing utilities with her actual rank insignia for the first time in 3 years. Senior Chief Petty Officer. The words felt like breathing again. She was training 40 Navy corpsmen in advanced trauma protocols, and her hands moved through the demonstrations with the same steady precision that had kept men alive in the dust and darkness. The official consulting position had been offered immediately after her identity became public, the Navy calling in its own, the military understanding what civilian institutions had missed. She split her time between Camp Pendleton and Oak Creek Memorial now, where administration had created an emergency procedures training program with her as director. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same hospital that had tried to erase her was now building its reputation on teaching others how she operated. Her son stood in the back of the classroom, now stationed at Pendleton himself, watching his mother teach the skills that had kept his father's teammates alive. Staff Sergeant James Chen Jr. had finally seen what she'd kept hidden. She'd watched him cry during the board hearing, watched him stand in her hospital room afterward, watched him understand that every closed break room, every humiliation, every quiet evening alone had been her way of protecting him from knowing the truth until the truth became unavoidable. Captain Marcus Chen recovered fully and returned to his unit. He kept the faded unit patch Sarah had given him, the same one sewn inside her jacket lining, and wore it with the understanding that she'd chosen to carry it through her exile, that she'd never forgotten what it meant, that she'd kept the promise even when everyone thought she was just a nurse pushing medications and checking vitals. Sarah kept her husband's photo on her new office desk at Oak Creek Memorial, beside her Navy Cross in its presentation case, the medal finally visible instead of hidden like shame. The hospital dedicated the new trauma bay in her name, and on her first shift there, the staff, the same ones who'd cleared the break room when she sat down, who'd avoided her eyes in the hallways, lined up to apologize. She accepted each one with quiet dignity, the same composure she'd shown while absorbing their exile. She didn't need their apologies. She needed them to be better. At shift change, she touched the patch inside her jacket, the ritual unchanged from her time in Helmand Province. That small faded square of fabric meant everything. It meant honor. It meant the men she'd held together were still alive. It meant the promise had been kept. In a strip mall 12 miles away, Dr. Hargrove watched an elderly couple walk past his insurance table without stopping, their hospital employee badges visible on their belts. They didn't recognize him, or they did and pretended not to. His phone hadn't rung in for hours. A for lease sign was going up in the storefront next to him. The management company had decided to consolidate. He had 2 weeks to remove the table. In the training bay, Sarah demonstrated a pericardiocentesis on a simulator, her hands as steady as they were in Helmand Province, as steady as they were that night in the emergency department when she'd saved Captain Chen's life. A young corpsman, couldn't have been more than 19, still carrying baby fat in his cheeks, asked how she stayed calm under pressure. Her hand touched the patch through her jacket. "You remember who you're doing it for," she said. "Everything else is just noise." The closing frame would show her standing between her son and Captain Chen at the dedication ceremony, their uniforms aligned, their patches matching, the rain from an earlier storm still glistening on the new building's windows. 3 people who understood sacrifice. 3 people who knew what it meant to keep moving forward when everything wanted to stop you. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, hit subscribe. If you've ever had to hide who you really are to survive, drop a comment and let me know your story. Like this video, and we'll see you next time.